My name is Alina Carter, and for most of my life, my mother believed I would never amount to anything. She called me reckless, a dreamer, a failure waiting to happen. But she didn't know that every cruel word was fuel, fuel that would one day build the life she never imagined I could have. This is the story of how the girl she dismissed became the woman she now calls for help. The camera lingers on a close-up of Alina's reflection in a high-rise window, confident, composed, a company badge clipped to her jacket. A single phone buzz shatters the silence. That call, the one I'd waited years for, came from the very person who once told me I'd fail. I still remember the heavy stillness of that night, the kind of silence that makes every heartbeat sound like a drum inside your chest. My name is Alina Carter, and the final words my mother hurled at me before I stepped out of her house still echo like a scar I can't erase. You'll never make it without us. I had spent years living under her sharp expectations, every choice of mine dissected and dismissed, every dream labeled a childish fantasy. That night, as the porch light flickered above the door, I clutched a single worn suitcase and felt the weight of both fear and freedom pressing against my ribs. The air smelt faintly of rain, like the world was trying to cleanse the pain I carried. I wanted to cry, but the tears refused to fall. I needed every ounce of strength to take that first step into the unknown. Inside, our final argument still burned like fresh fire. My mother's voice had risen higher with every sentence, her frustration twisting into cruel certainty. You're wasting your life, Alina. You have no plan, no discipline. You'll fail out there, and when you do, don't come crawling back. My father stood silently in the corner, his eyes downcast, his silence cutting deeper than any shouted insult. I begged for even a flicker of understanding, but none came. In that moment, I realized that staying would mean surrendering every dream I had ever dared to imagine. Leaving wasn't just rebellion, it was survival. The bus station felt like another planet compared to the suffocating tension of home. Fluorescent lights hummed above rows of cracked plastic seats, and the faint smell of coffee and exhaust hung in the air. I bought my ticket with trembling hands, staring at the destination printed in bold black letters as if it held the secret to a new life. As I sat waiting, I studied the faces around me, strangers carrying their own stories of escape, heartbreak, or hope. A young mother rocked a sleeping child. An old man dozed with a suitcase that looked as tired as he did. For the first time, I realized that running away didn't make me weak. It made me part of a quiet army of people daring to rewrite their own lives. When the bus finally arrived, its headlights sliced through the darkness like a promise. Each mile we traveled away from that house loosened a knot inside my chest. The city lights faded into a blur, and reflections of passing street signs flickered across the window like fleeting ghosts of the past. I thought about the bed I'd left behind, the meals we'd once shared, and the warmth of a home that had turned into a battleground. Fear whispered that I might be making the biggest mistake of my life, but a louder voice, one I hadn't heard before, told me I was choosing myself for the first time. By the time the bus rolled toward the faint glow of a distant city, I knew there was no turning back. Whatever waited ahead, failure or triumph, it would be mine to claim. If leaving home was the hardest decision I had ever made, surviving the months that followed was a battle I never could have imagined. Freedom was supposed to feel like lightness, but in reality, it pressed on me like a weight I carried everywhere. My name is Alina Carter, and in those early days, independence tasted like burnt coffee and loneliness. I worked until my hands blistered, until my feet ached so badly I could barely stand, and still the numbers in my bank account barely shifted. Every coin mattered, every bus fare, every carton of milk, every light bulb I dared to keep switched on after midnight. My first job was at a cramped cafe tucked between a pawn shop and a flickering neon laundromat. The hours were brutal. Mornings began before the sky even thought of turning blue, and nights ended long after the last customer had drained their cup. The manager barely looked at me, except to scold me when an order took too long. I washed endless towers of dishes, wiped down sticky tables, and brewed pot after pot of coffee that smelled far stronger than my paycheck. Some nights, after an unexpected expense or a slow shift, I would count my tips in the dim glow of a street lamp and feel panic rise in my throat. There were weeks when I had to choose between paying the electric bill or buying a proper meal. Loneliness crept in like an uninvited guest. At home, I had grown used to the constant presence of voices, even when those voices carried sharp words. In the city, silence followed me everywhere. My rented room was quiet, except for the hum of the fridge and the occasional thump from a neighbor's television. Friends were scarce. My coworkers rotated in and out so quickly that names barely stuck, and the few classmates I met at night courses seemed to have their own worlds to rush back to. I spent nights eating cold leftovers on the edge of my bed, my only company the soft buzz of streetlights filtering through thin curtains. Still, I refused to let my mother's prophecy come true. "You'll fail," she had said. Those words replayed in my mind every time I felt the urge to quit. They became a strange kind of fuel, an invisible fire that kept me moving even when exhaustion threatened to crush me. I started looking for ways to stretch my skills beyond the cafe. Bulletin boards at community centers became my secret treasure maps. Lists of free workshops, career fairs, and night classes taped beside outdated posters. I attended budgeting seminars, computer basic sessions, and job search groups. I learned how to write a sharper resume and how to present myself with confidence, even when my knees shook with nerves. But the city seemed determined to test me. Bills piled up faster than my wages. My landlord raised the rent with a casual shrug, explaining that it's just the market. One night, an eviction notice appeared like a knife on my door, an ugly piece of paper stamped with cold black letters that threatened to unravel everything I'd worked for. I stood in the hallway staring at it, my hands trembling until the hallway light flickered out. That night, I barely slept, running numbers in my head until the sun came up. The fear of losing my tiny room was like a cold stone lodged in my chest, but it also sparked something fierce inside me. If I wanted to stay, I had to fight harder than ever. So I doubled down. I picked up extra shifts, sometimes working 16-hour days. I skipped meals to save a few dollars, learned to mend my own clothes, and bartered small favors for groceries. My body ached constantly, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance in my bank account began to grow instead of shrink. Each small victory, each bill paid on time, felt like a silent rebellion against the voice of doubt that had followed me from home. There were moments of grace, too, tiny flashes that kept me from sinking completely. A kind customer once left a $20 tip with a note that read, "Don't give up." A stranger at the bus stop shared her umbrella during a sudden downpour, and we ended up talking for an hour about dreams we both refused to abandon. These small acts of humanity reminded me that even in struggle, the world held pockets of kindness waiting to be discovered. By the time autumn painted the city in shades of rust and gold, I had learned more about myself than any classroom could teach me. I discovered that I could survive on very little, that I could endure sleepless nights and relentless schedules without collapsing. Most importantly, I learned that my worth wasn't tied to anyone else's belief or disbelief in me. My mother's voice still haunted my quiet moments, but it no longer defined them. Every rent payment made on time, every shift worked without complaint, every night I managed to keep the lights on was proof that she had been wrong. The struggle didn't end with a single breakthrough or dramatic victory. It was a slow, grinding climb, but it hardened me in ways I would need for the battles ahead. What I didn't know then was that these small, silent wins were preparing me for the moment when opportunity, real opportunity, would finally knock. And when it did, I would be ready to answer. Life in the city didn't welcome me with open arms. It tested me at every turn. In those first months, survival became a skill I had to learn the hard way. Rent devoured most of the small paychecks I earned from endless double shifts at a dingy cafe, leaving barely enough for groceries or the bus fare to get back to my tiny room each night. The neighborhood was loud and restless, filled with the constant hum of traffic and the sharp calls of late-night vendors. Some nights, exhaustion dragged me to the edge of tears, but I refused to let my mother's prophecy of failure become the truth of my life. Every sunrise was a quiet vow. I would prove her wrong, even if it meant clawing my way forward inch by inch. I began searching for any skill that could lift me out of the grind. Flyers on community bulletin boards became my lifeline. Free night classes, workshops, and networking meetups. I signed up for everything I could find. Basic computer courses, budgeting seminars, even a public speaking workshop that terrified me. Most days I raced from the cafe to the classroom, my apron still smelling faintly of burnt coffee, my fingers stiff from scrubbing dishes. The lessons were small at first. How to write a clean resume, how to code a simple website, but each one felt like a brick laid on the path toward a future I was finally building with my own hands. Money was tight and rejections came often. I sent out dozens of applications for part-time internships, freelance gigs, anything that promised more than minimum wage. Most went unanswered, and the few interviews I landed ended with polite smiles and empty promises. Every "will be in touch" felt like a door closing in my face. There were nights when I sat on my narrow bed with a laptop balanced on my knees, scrolling through job boards until my eyes blurred, wondering if I was chasing a dream that would never catch me back. But deep inside, a quiet spark kept burning, a belief that hard work, even when unseen, would eventually lead to a breakthrough. Then one night after class, an instructor mentioned a small startup looking for someone to help manage their website. It wasn't glamorous, and it barely paid more than my cafe shifts, but it offered something priceless, a chance to learn real skills in the digital world. I stayed up all night crafting a pitch, pouring every ounce of determination into a single email. When their reply arrived the next morning with the words, "We'd like to meet you," I felt a surge of hope so strong it left me breathless. That tiny freelance contract became my lifeline. Each completed task taught me something new about coding, about business, about resilience. Slowly, my bank account grew from empty to stable, and with every small deposit, I felt the chains of my past loosen. My mother's voice still haunted me in quiet moments, but now it fueled me differently. I wasn't running anymore. I was climbing. The breakthrough didn't arrive with fireworks or flashing signs. It came quietly, disguised as a single email in my overcrowded inbox. I almost deleted it, thinking it was just another polite rejection, but the subject line caught my eye. Interview request, startup web project. My heart skipped once, then twice. After months of unanswered applications and false hopes, here was a message that felt different. I read it 3 times before I believed it was real. The interview was scheduled for a rainy Thursday afternoon. The city streets shimmered under slick umbrellas as I made my way to a small co-working space tucked behind a row of brick buildings. My shoes were still damp from the puddles when I stepped inside, but the room smelled faintly of fresh paint and possibility. 3 people sat around a shared desk cluttered with laptops, coffee cups, and sticky notes filled with wild ideas. They weren't wearing suits or stiff smiles. They greeted me like an equal, not an outsider. For the first time in months, I felt like I belonged somewhere. They explained that their startup needed someone to help manage their website and organize client projects. The pay wasn't extraordinary, barely more than my cafe shifts, but it offered something priceless: experience, growth, and a chance to create rather than merely endure. I answered their questions carefully, my voice steady despite the storm of nerves inside me. I spoke about the night classes I'd taken, the small freelance gigs I'd managed, and the long hours I'd spent teaching myself coding basics. When one of them smiled and said, "You're exactly the kind of person we need," I felt a surge of relief so strong it left me dizzy. The job started the following week. I kept my cafe shifts for a while, terrified of letting go of any income, but my focus quickly shifted to the startup. Days were long, but for the first time, the hours passed like minutes. I built web pages late into the night, double-checking every line of code as the city outside my window glittered with possibility. There were mistakes, of course, broken links, misaligned images, late-night panics when servers crashed, but each challenge became a lesson I refused to forget. Unlike the cafe, where effort went unnoticed, here every extra hour, every spark of creativity was valued. As weeks turned into months, small victories began to stack up. A client praised the clean layout I had designed, a developer taught me shortcuts that saved hours of work. My name began to appear on project credits, and my responsibilities grew faster than I had ever imagined. I was no longer the girl scraping tips into a jar just to keep the lights on. I was a contributor, a creator, someone shaping something bigger than herself. Each paycheck, though modest, felt like proof that I was finally climbing out of survival mode. I'll never forget the night we launched our first major client site. The office was nearly empty except for a few of us huddled around glowing screens. Outside, the city was asleep, but inside, the air pulsed with nervous excitement. I pressed the final publish button with shaking fingers. When the page went live without a single error, cheers erupted. Someone brought out a bottle of cheap champagne, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to celebrate without fear of what tomorrow might bring. In that small office, surrounded by people who believed in my work, I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood, pride that didn't need anyone else's approval. That night, as I walked home under the flickering streetlights, I thought about my mother. I imagined her sitting in the same living room where she once told me I'd never make it. Did she know what I was building? Would she even care if she did? The questions stung, but they also fueled me. I realized that my success no longer needed her recognition. This journey wasn't about proving her wrong anymore. It was about proving myself right. The startup job opened doors I hadn't even known existed. My growing portfolio attracted new clients, and small freelance offers began to land in my inbox. Each one felt like another rung on the ladder I was determined to climb. The money was still modest, but for the first time, I could pay my rent without flinching, buy groceries without counting each coin, and even save a little for the future. The fear of eviction that once haunted my nights slowly faded into the background, replaced by a cautious optimism. Looking back, that email, the one I nearly deleted, was more than a job offer. It was a turning point. The first undeniable proof that my effort, my sleepless nights, and my stubborn refusal to quit were finally paying off. It was the first crack in the wall that had separated me from the life I wanted. What I didn't know then was that this small break was just the beginning. Bigger opportunities were on the horizon, waiting for me to be ready. And for the first time in my life, I believed I would be.
It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that usually passed without consequence. My apartment was bathed in soft golden light as I sat by the window, sipping lukewarm coffee and reviewing a client proposal. My phone buzzed once on the table. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a routine notification, until I noticed the name glowing on the screen. It was Mom. For a moment, I froze. The name felt heavy, like a stone I wasn't ready to lift. Months, no, years had passed with only occasional curt messages between us. We hadn't spoken properly since the night I left home, when her words had cut through me like sharp glass. You'll come crawling back when you fail. I had imagined this call countless times, but never with her name actually flashing on my phone. My heart pounded, each beat a collision of old pain and reluctant curiosity. I let it ring twice before my thumb slid across the screen. Hello? My voice trembled, betraying the calm I tried to project. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then I heard it, her voice, hesitant and unfamiliar. Alina? It's me. I swallowed hard. The sound of her voice unlocked memories I had buried under layers of determination. She didn't start with anger, nor with the sharp criticism I had grown used to. Instead, her tone was soft, almost fragile. I need your help," she said. The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. My mother, the woman who once told me I was destined to fail, was asking me for help. She explained, haltingly, that my father's health had taken a sudden turn. He'd suffered a minor heart episode, and while he was recovering, the medical bills were piling up. Their small business was faltering. They were weeks away from losing their house. Her voice cracked as she admitted, "I didn't know who else to call." I listened in stunned silence, 1,000 emotions colliding inside me. Part of me wanted to scream, to remind her of every cruel word she had ever thrown my way. Another part of me, a quieter, stronger part, couldn't ignore the urgency in her voice. I could picture her standing in the kitchen where we'd shared so many tense dinners, gripping the phone with the same stubbornness that had once pushed me away. "Why me?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Because you're the only one I can trust," she whispered. The words broke something open inside me. I didn't answer right away. My mind replayed every insult, every dismissal. The girl who had once begged for her approval still lived inside me. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I was the woman who built a career from scratch, the woman who carved a life without anyone's permission. "I'll help," I said at last, my voice steady now, "but things can't go back to the way they were." There was a pause, a long, aching silence. Then she said something I never expected to hear. "I'm sorry, Alina." The apology was quiet, almost lost to the static on the line, but it was there. My mother, the unshakable pillar of pride and control, was admitting regret. We spoke for nearly an hour. She told me about the endless hospital visits, the late nights spent balancing bills, the fear of losing everything they had worked for. I offered practical advice, suggesting payment plans and financial resources I had learned about through my own struggles. I promised to send some money to help cover immediate expenses. But beneath the logistics, something deeper was happening. With every exchange, the walls that had stood between us for years began to crumble, brick by brick. After the call ended, I sat in silence, staring at the fading sunset outside my window. My emotions were a tangled knot: relief, sorrow, vindication, and a cautious hope I hadn't dared to feel in years. She had called me not as a last resort, but as someone she finally respected. That night, I wired the money she needed. It wasn't about the amount. It was about what it represented. I was no longer the desperate child seeking validation. I was the adult who could stand on her own and still choose compassion. In the days that followed, our conversations grew more frequent. They were still awkward at times, but softer, more human. She asked about my work, my life, even my dreams, questions she had never cared to ask before. For the first time, she listened. Helping my parents didn't erase the pain of the past, but it transformed it. The girl my mother once dismissed had become the woman she now relied on. And as I looked back on the long, winding road that had brought me here, I realized something profound. My greatest victory wasn't in proving her wrong, but in becoming someone strong enough to help her even when she had once refused to help me. The call that began with desperation ended with something far more powerful: understanding. And in that understanding, I found a quiet, unexpected peace. Weeks turned into months after that unexpected call, and the quiet rhythm of my life began to shift. The startup I'd built from late-night coding sessions and relentless freelancing was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. Contracts poured in, partnerships blossomed, and for the first time, I found myself hiring employees instead of begging for small gigs.
My name, once dismissed within my own family, was now spoken with respect in boardrooms and business conferences. Yet even with this success, a part of me carried the weight of unfinished history with my parents, particularly with my mother. When I finally returned to the house I had once fled, I felt a strange mix of pride and hesitation. The driveway, cracked from years of neglect, looked smaller than I remembered. The garden, where I used to hide during arguments, was overgrown, as if time itself had grown weary of keeping up appearances. As I stepped onto the porch, I felt the old ghost stir, the echo of slammed doors, the sting of her words, the quiet sobs I'd once hidden from the world. The door creaked open before I could knock. My mother stood there, her face older, softer, yet still marked by the sharp determination that had once terrified me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached for me, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Alina," she whispered, my name trembling in the air like a fragile bridge between past and present. I hugged her, hesitant at first, but the embrace deepened as years of silence began to crack. When we finally stepped inside, the house smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm tea, a reminder of my father's recent illness and the care it demanded. He sat in the living room, thinner than I remembered, but his eyes lit up when he saw me. His smile was weak but genuine. "You made it," he said softly, and for the first time, those words didn't feel like an accusation, but a welcome. Over tea, my mother began to talk, really talk. She spoke of the fear that had fueled her harshness, of the sacrifices she had made in silence, of the expectations that had hardened into cruelty. "I thought pushing you would make you strong," she admitted, her voice breaking. I didn't realize it was breaking something else instead. I listened, the anger I had carried for years flickering like a candle in a draft. Part of me wanted to cling to it, to remind her of every sleepless night, every cruel remark. But as she spoke, I began to see the woman behind the words, the young mother who had once been scared, trapped by her own unfulfilled dreams. Her cruelty was armor, not truth. When it was my turn to speak, I chose honesty over bitterness. I said, "You hurt me, but leaving, building my own life, it saved me. And it showed me I'm capable of more than either of us ever imagined." Her eyes filled with tears. "I know," she whispered, "and I'm proud of you. I just wish I had said it sooner." Those words, simple yet monumental, landed like a healing balm on wounds I thought would never close. For years, I had chased success to prove her wrong, and that moment I realized I no longer needed her validation. My worth was no longer tied to her approval. It had grown far beyond it. Before I left that evening, I walked through the house one last time. The rooms seemed smaller now, the walls less imposing. It wasn't the fortress of pain I had once escaped. It was simply a house, aging and imperfect, holding memories both bitter and sweet. As I stood by the doorway, my mother placed a hand on my arm. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping us, for not turning away." I smiled, a gentle but resolute smile. I said, "You taught me to be strong. Maybe not in the way you intended, but it worked." Driving back to the city, the night sky stretched endlessly above me. Streetlights flickered against the windshield like quiet reminders of every step I had taken to reach this point. The journey hadn't been about revenge, not really. It had been about reclaiming my own story, about proving to myself that I was more than the names they once called me. As I merged onto the highway, a calm certainty settled over me. I had come full circle, not to seek approval, not to gloat, but to stand as the woman I had become. My mother's apology, my father's quiet gratitude, and my own unshakable independence were all pieces of the same victory. In the end, success wasn't the company badge or the financial stability. It was this moment, driving away from the house that once defined my worth, knowing it no longer held power over me. I was no longer the girl who left in tears. I was the woman who returned in strength and left again, free.